Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be reading from The New God Image by Dr. Edward Edinger. And the subtitle of this book is A Study of Jung's Key Letters Concerning the Evolution of the Western God Image. And this is a behind-the-scenes reading, so there will be goofs in my reading. This is not edited as yet, and so you're just following along with me. I'll be happy to take any comments you may bring to me as I read. This is a letter to Pastor Walter Bernet, and it's dated June the 13th, 1955. At last I have got down to reading and studying your book, which you so kindly sent me. Please put the slowness of this procedure down to my old age. It was certainly not lack of interest that kept me reading so long, but rather a curiosity, or, more accurately, a need to familiarize myself with and to learn to understand the theological mode of thinking, which is so alien to me. I have been able to assimilate this thinking only very fragmentarily, if at all, in spite or perhaps because of the fact that I come from a theological milieu on my mother's side, and my father was himself a clergyman. It was the tragedy of my youth to see my father cracking up before my eyes on the problem of his faith and dying an early death. This was the objective outer event that opened my eyes to the importance of religion. Subjective inner experiences prevented me from drawing negative conclusions about religion from my father's fate, much as I was tempted to do so. I grew up in the heyday of scientific materialism, studied natural science and medicine, and became a psychiatrist. My education offered me nothing but arguments against religion on the one hand, and on the other the charisma of faith was denied me. I was thrown back on experience alone. Always Paul's experience on the road to Damascus hovered before me, and I asked myself how his fate would have fallen out but for his visions. Yet this experience came upon him while he was blindly pursuing his own way. As a young man, I drew the conclusion that you must obviously fulfill your destiny in order to get to the point where a donum gratiae might happen along. But I was far from certain and always kept the possibility in mind that on this road I might end up in a black hole. I have remained true to this attitude all my life. So I'll put up Paul's vision once again, but this time smaller so that you can see me in the picture as well. Yeah, the photo credit here is from a photograph I got from dreamstime.com, which is a photograph of a stained glass window at the Cathedral of Cologne. And there it is. From this you can easily see the origin of my psychology. Only by going my own way, integrating my capacities headlong, like Paul, and thus creating a foundation for myself, could something be vouchsafed to me or built upon it, no matter where it came from, and of which I could be reasonably sure that it was not merely one of my own neglected capacities. The only way open to me was the experience of religious realities, which I had to accept without regard to their truth. In this matter, I have no criterion except the fact that they seem meaningful to me and harmonize with man's best utterances. I don't know whether the archetype is true or not. I only know that it lives and that I have not made it. Since the number of possibilities is limited, one soon comes to a frontier, or rather to frontiers which recede behind one another, presumably up to the point of death. The experience of these frontiers gradually brings the conviction that what is experienced is an endless approximation. The goal of this approximation seems to be anticipated by archetypal symbols which represent something like the circumambulation of a center. With increasing approximation to the center, there is a corresponding depotentiation of the ego in favor of the influence of the empty center, which is certainly not identical with the archetype, but is the thing the archetype points to. As the Chinese would say, the archetype is only the name of Tao, not Tao itself. Just as the Jesuits translated Tao as God, so we can describe the emptiness of the center as God. Emptiness in this sense doesn't mean absence or vacancy, but something unknowable which is endowed with the highest intensity. If I call this unknowable the self, all that has happened is that the effects of the unknowable have been given an aggregate name, but its contents are not affected in any way. An indeterminably large part of my own being is included in it, but because this part is the unconscious, I cannot indicate its limits or its extent. The self is therefore a borderline concept, not by any means filled out with the known psychic processes. On the one hand, it includes the phenomenon of synchronicity. On the other, its archetype is embedded in the brain structure and is physiologically verifiable through electrical stimulation of a certain area of the brainstem of an epileptic. It is reread that sentence. Through electrical stimulation of a certain area of the brainstem of an epileptic, it is possible to produce mandala visions, quadratura circuli. From synchronistic phenomena, we learn that a peculiar feature of the psychoid background is transgressivity in space and time. This brings us directly to the frontier of transcendence, beyond which human statements can only be mythological. Welcome to the reading. I'm reading from a letter from Dr. C.G. Jung to Pastor Walter Bernet, dated June the 13th, 1955. I'm about a sixth of the way through the letter at this point. The whole course of individuation is dialectical, and the so-called end is the confrontation of the ego with the emptiness of the center. Here the limit of possible experience is reached. The ego dissolves as the reference point of cognition. It cannot coincide with the center, otherwise we would be insensible. That is to say, the extinction of the ego is at best an endless approximation, but if the ego usurps the center, it loses its object. He puts in parentheses, inflation. Even though you add to my ultimate and absolute, it's referring to Pastor Bernet's book. He says, even though you add to my ultimate and absolute ultimate, you will hardly maintain that my ultimate is not as good an ultimate as yours. In any case, all possibility of cognition and prediction, and in any case, all possibility of cognition and predication ceases for me at this frontier because of the extinction of the ego. The ego can merely affirm that something vitally important is happening to it. It may conjecture that it has come up against something greater, that it feels powerless against this greater power, that it can cognize nothing further, that in the course of the integration process it has become convinced of its fitness, that in the course of the integration process it has become convinced of its finiteness, just as before it was compelled to take practical account of the existence of an ineluctable archetype. The ego has to acknowledge many gods before it attains the center, where no god helps it any longer against another god. It now occurs to me, and I hope I am not deceiving myself, that from the point where you introduced the absolute ultimate, which is meant to replace my descriptive concept of the self by an empty abstraction, the archetype is increasingly detached from its dynamic background and gradually turned into a purely intellectual formula. In this way, it is neutralized, and you can then say one can live, and you can then say one can live with it quite well, but you overlook the fact that the self-constellating archetypes and the resultant situations steadily gain in numinosity, indeed are sometimes imbued with a positively eerie demonism, and bring the danger of psychosis threateningly close. The upsurging archetypal material is the stuff of which mental illnesses are made. In the individuation process, the ego is brought face to face with an unknown superior power, which is likely to cut the ground from under its feet and blow consciousness to bits. The archetype is not just the formal condition for mythological statements, but an overwhelming force comparable to nothing I know. In view of the terrors of this confrontation, I would never dream of addressing this menacing and fascinating opponent familiarly as thou, though paradoxically it also has this aspect. All talk of this opponent is mythology. All statements about and beyond the ultimate are anthropomorphisms, and if anyone should think that when he says God, he has also predicated God, he is endowing his words with magical power. Like a primitive, he is incapable of distinguishing the verbal image from the reality. In one breath, he will endorse the statement, Deus est ineffable, In one breath, he will endorse the statement, Deus est ineffabilis. Deus est ineffable. Deus est ineffabilis. God is ineffable. So, in one breath, he will endorse the statement, Deus est ineffabilis, without a thought. But in the next, he will be speaking of God as though he could express him. It seems to me, and I beg your pardon in advance if I am doing you an injustice, that something of the sort has happened to you. You write, apparently without any misgivings, that I equate God with the self. You seem not to have noticed that I speak of the God image and not of God, because it is quite beyond me to say anything about God at all. It is more than astonishing that you have failed to perceive this fundamental distinction. It is shattering. I don't know what you must take me for. I don't know what you must take me for if you can't impute such stupidity. I don't know what you can take me for if you can impute such stupidities to me after you yourself have correctly presented my epistemological standpoint at the beginning of your book. I have in all conscience never supposed that in discussing the psyche, I have in all conscience never supposed that in discussing the psychic structure of the God image, I have taken God himself in hand. I am not a word magician or a word fetishist who thinks that he can posit or call up a metaphysical reality with his incantation. Sorry. Sorry, this just tickles me. Oh my God. Now I have to find my place. I am not a word magician or word fetishist who thinks he can posit or call up a metaphysical reality with his incantations. Don't Protestant critics accuse the Catholic Mass of magic when it asserts that by pronouncing the words hoc est corpus meum, Christ is actually present. In Job and elsewhere, I am always explicitly speaking of the God image. When he's referring to Job here, he's referring to Answer to Job, which was his book published a couple years earlier. In Job and elsewhere, I am always explicitly speaking of the God image. If my theologian critics choose to overlook this, the fault lies with them and not with me. They obviously think that the little word God conjures him up in reality, just as the Mass forces Christ to appear through the words of the consecration. Naturally, I am aware of the dissident Catholic explanation of this. I do not share your overvaluation of words and have never regarded the equation Christ equals Logos as anything else than an interesting symbol conditioned by its time. This credulity and entrapment in words is becoming more and more striking nowadays. Proof of this is the rise of such a comical philosophy as existentialism, which labors to help being become being through the magical power of the word. People still believe that they can posit or replace reality by words, or that something has happened when a thing is given a different name. If I call the ultimate the self, and you call it the absolute ultimate, its ultimateness is not changed one whit. The name means far less to me than the view associated with it. You seem to think that I enjoy romping about in a circus. You seem to think that I enjoy romping about in a circus of archetypal figures, and that I take them for ultimate realities which block my view of the ineffable. They guide, but they also mislead. They guide, but they also mislead. How much I reserve my criticism for them, you can see in Answer to Job, where I subject archetypal statements to what you call blasphemous criticism. The very fact that you consider this critique of anthropomorphisms worthy of condemnation proves how strongly you are bound to these psychic products by word magic. I'm going to read that sentence again. The very fact that you consider this critique of anthropomorphisms worthy of condemnation proves how strongly you are bound to these psychic products by word magic. If theologians think that whenever they say God, then God is, they are deifying anthropomorphisms, psychic structures, and myths. This is exactly what I don't do, for I must repeat, I speak exclusively of the God image in Job. Who talks of divine knowledge and divine revelation? Certainly not me. Ultimately, I have really reached the ultimate with my presumptuous anthropomorphisms, which feign knowledge and revelation. I see many God images of various kinds. I find myself compelled to make mythological statements, but I know that none of them expresses or captures the immeasurable other, even if I were to assert that it did. However interesting or enthralling metaphysical statements may be, I must still criticize them as anthropomorphisms. But here the theologian buttonholes me, asseverating that his anthropomorphism is God and damning anyone who criticizes any anthropomorphic weaknesses, defects, and contradictions in it as a and damning anyone who criticizes any anthropomorphic weaknesses, defects, and contradictions in it as a blasphemer. It is not God who is insulted by the worm, but the theologian who can't or won't admit that his concept is anthropomorphic. With this, he puts an end to the much-needed discussion and understanding of religious statements. Just as Bultmann's demythologizing procedure stops at the point where the demagicking of words no longer seems advisable to him, so the theologian treats exactly the same concept as mythological, i.e., an anthropomorphic at one moment and as an inviolable, i.e., anthropomorphic at one moment and as an inviolable taboo at the next. I have begged 4 distinguished academic theologians to tell me what exactly is the attitude of modern Protestantism to the question of the identity of the God of the Old Testament with the God of the New, between whom the layman thinks he can spot quite a number of differences. The question is so harmless that it is like asking what the difference is between Freud's view of the unconscious and mine. 2 didn't answer at all, despite repeated requests. The third told me that there was no longer any talk of God in the theological literature of the last 20 years anyway. The fourth said the question was very easy to answer. Yahweh was simply a somewhat archaic God concept in comparison with the New Testament, whereupon I replied, "Look, my dear professor, this is just the kind of psychologism the theologians accuse me of. Suddenly, the divine revelation in the Old Testament is nothing but an archaic concept, and the revelation in the New Testament is simply a modern one. But the next moment, this same revelation is God himself and no concept at all. So you ride the hobby horse of your choice. Sorry, I'll look up here a moment. What's Death Metal Mason asked me, what's so funny? I'm sorry, I'm beyond that point in this letter. I'll go back and look in a minute, but there's another one coming up. And thank you so much for the reading, Jung. And Death Metal Mason says, agreed. I'm not sure how I would have heard this otherwise. Probably you wouldn't. But I'm reading from The New God Image by Dr. Edward Edinger, published by Chiron Publications. And this is in the appendix. This is one of the 14 letters in the appendix of this book. Carrying on now. So you ride the hobby horse of your choice. In order to do away with such tricks, I stick to my proposal that we take all talk of God as mythological and discuss these mythologisms honestly. As soon as we open our mouths, we speak in traditional verbal images, and even when we merely think, we think in age-old psychic structures. If God were to reveal himself to us, we have nothing except our psychic organs to register his revelation, and could not express it except in the images of our everyday speech. Let the Protestant theologian, therefore, abandon his hierarchical word magic and his alleged knowledge of God through faith, and admit to the layman that he is mythologizing and is just as incapable as he is of expressing God himself. And admit to the layman that he is mythologizing and is just as incapable as he is of expressing God himself. Let him not vilify and condemn and twist the arguments of others who are struggling just as earnestly. Let him not vilify and condemn and twist the arguments of others who are struggling just as earnestly to understand the mysteries of religion, even if he finds these arguments personally disagreeable, to give due regard to the epistemological premises of Answer to Job if you want to criticize it. I think I skipped a couple of lines. My vision isn't what it used to be. Let me read that again. Let him not vilify and condemn and twist the arguments of others who are struggling just as earnestly to understand the mysteries of religion, even if he finds these arguments personally disagreeable or wrong in themselves. In parentheses, he writes, I cannot exempt you, for one, from the obligation to give due regard to the epistemological premises of Answer to Job, if you want to criticize it. So long as we are conscious of ourselves, we are supposed by the psyche and its structure. Oops, I misread that. So long as we are conscious of ourselves, we are supported by the psychic and the structure. So long as we are conscious of ourselves, we are supported by the psyche and its structures, and at the same time imprisoned in them with no possibility of getting outside ourselves. We would not feel and be aware of ourselves at all. We would not feel or be aware of ourselves at all were we not always confronted with the unknown power. Without this, we would not be conscious of our separateness, just as there is no consciousness without an object. We are not delivered from the sin of mythologizing by saying that we are saved or redeemed through the revelation of God in Christ, for this is simply another mythologem, which does, however, contain a psychological truth. Consequently, we can understand the feeling of redemption, which is bound up with the mythologem, but the statement revelation in Christ merely affirms that a myth of this kind exists, which evidently belongs to the symbolism of the self. What impresses me most profoundly in discussions with theologians of both camps is that metaphysical statements are made apparently without the slightest awareness that they are talking in mythic images, which pass directly as the Word of God. For this reason, it is so often thoughtlessly assumed that I do the same thing, whereas quite to the contrary, I am trained by my daily profession, whereas quite to the contrary, I am trained by my daily professional work to distinguish scrupulously between idea and reality. The recognition of projections is indeed one of the most important tasks of psychotherapy. I have read your erudite book with great interest and profit, and find it all the more regrettable that in spite of your admirably objective presentation of my standpoint at the beginning, you nevertheless go off the rails at the end. You think I have deviated from my epistemological position in Job. Had you read the introduction, you could never have pronounced. Had you read the introduction, you could had you read the introduction, you could never have pronounced this false judgment. I can understand very well that you are shocked by the book. I was too, and by the original Job into the bargain. I feel you have in general too poor an opinion of me when you charge me with the arrogance of wanting to write an exegesis of Job. I don't know a word of Hebrew. As a layman, sorry. As a layman, I have only tried to read the translated text with psychological common sense, on the assumption, certainly, that I am dealing with anthropomorphisms and not with magical words that conjure up God himself. If in the Jewish commentaries the high priest takes the liberty of admonishing Adonai to remember his good rather than his bad qualities, it is no longer so shocking if I avail myself of a similar criticism, especially as I am not even addressing Adonai, as the high priest did, but merely the anthropomorphic God image, and expressly refrain from all metaphysical utterances, which the high priest did not. You will scarcely suppose that, despite my assurances to the contrary, the mere pronouncing of God's name You will scarcely suppose that, despite my assurances to the contrary, the mere pronouncing of God's name conjures up God himself. At all events, Adonai took the high priest's criticism and a number of other equally drastic observations without a murmur, thereby showing himself to be more tolerant than certain theologians. The reason why mythic statements invariably lead to word magic is that the archetype possesses a numinous autonomy and has a psychic life of its own. I have dealt with this particular difficulty at some length in Job. Perhaps I may remark in conclusion that the theory of archetypes is more difficult, and I am not quite so stupid as you apparently think. I can I cannot omit to thank you all the same, but the great trouble you have taken in going into my proposition is so thoroughly... I cannot omit to thank you all the same for the great trouble you have gone... For the great trouble you have taken in going into my proposition so thoroughly. It is obvious that this cannot be done without difficulties and misunderstandings, especially in view of the fact that our age is still, for the most part, trapped in its belief in words. Ancient Greece was on an even lower level, as the term phrenes, which is psychic connotation, shows. Ancient Greece was on an even lower level, as the term phrenes, with its psychic connotation, shows. The Pueblo Indians of New Mexico still think in the heart and not in the head. Tantra Yoga gives the classic localizations of thought, anahata, thinking, or localization of consciousness, in the chest region, phrenes. Visuddha, localized in the larynx, verbal thinking, and the ajna, vision symbolized by an eye in the forehead, which is attained only when verbal image and object are no longer identical, i.e., when their participation mystique is abolished. I have this advance of human consciousness particularly at heart. It is a difficult task to which I have devoted all my life's work. This is the reason why I venture to plague you with such a long letter. Yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. Now, I'll just note here that he had received a copy of Walter Bernet's book, which is called in English The Scope and Limit of Religious Experience, but it was written in German originally. And I'll just, at the very end of this letter, there's a footnote that is worth noting. The footnote says, a decade later, Bernet published extracts from Jung's letter with comments in an essay on Jung in a German periodical, it appears. I can't pronounce this, so I'm not going to try. He concluded, quote, this outsider of theology has, with the relentless determination with which he demands experience of man, with his uncomfortable criticism of ecclesiastical talk of God, with his bold vision, in particular of the Protestant Church, urged upon contemporary theological thought questions which, in the interest of theology, are absolutely necessary, and which, in their rigor, show the way. So, Pastor Bernet was convinced by Dr. Jung's letter, interestingly. Let's see. Now, so Death Metal Mason says, you're doing God's work. He will be one with us soon, and us one with him. Thank you for everything you do. Do you think it possible that the being of the depths from the Red Book could be an extension of a human psyche alive in modern times, reaching through the ethereal realm to conjure itself? I certainly think that, and if you take a moment to look at my experience of my vision with Mephistopheles, you will find a video, at least one video on that. And there's another video, I think, called Why Did I Make Such a Bad Deal with Mephistopheles? And then he says, I had an experience one night of getting drunk and high and just trying to do that before I had even heard Liber Novus. I've had a very strange existential experience that seems to be blurring the line between sense and nonsense, in a way of speaking. I think that many of us do have religious experiences. These are frequently synchronicities of some sort. I certainly have had many, and if you look at my playlist called Breakthroughs to the Unconscious, you'll see several on video. And let's see, there was one more request. I can't spend too much more time on this. Let me see if I can find this thing that I thought was very funny. I'm sorry, I was reading along and it just struck me as funny. So I'll set this up for playback so that you can listen to it in your own right once again, and then you can pick up what struck me as so funny. But sometimes Dr. Jung's dry humor really gets to me. Just a moment. Somebody's been trying to reach me regarding my car's extended warranty. How wonderful. So anyway, thank you for all being here. I have to depart right now, so I will try to do another reading in the next day or so. Talk to you soon. Thanks for being here today.